I'm AJ. My presentation is From Sign to Sound. It's about FM synthesis, and let's get into it. Maybe. Hold on. Okay. All right, cool. So what is FM synthesis? Well, FM synthesis is, FM stands for frequency modulation. It's a type of sound synthesis that modifies a wave using another wave. So you're modulating the frequency or the phase of a wave form to create a new wave. Don't worry about the definition. I'm kind of going to show everything. um, it'll hopefully make sense by the end of the presentation. So here's the synth that I built somewhere. And it initializes to a pure sine wave or a pure tone. And the reason why it's called a pure tone is because if you were to look at something called a Fourier transform, which is just a way of breaking down a signal into its component frequencies, you would see that there's only one peak in the graph here. If we were to go to a more complex sound, such as, an electric piano, you would see that just from playing a single note, right, we have a lot of overtones or sidebands that are coming up. And so that's, actually with any sound, like you're never going to find a pure tone out in the wild. Any sound you hear is always going to have overtones, and that's what gives different sounds their color or flavor. Okay, so how does it work? Well, first, let's kind of look at a pure tone to see how that looks in terms of the math. So here on this chart, the top axis shows the phase of the wave. So this is, if you were to take a sine wave and plot it versus t, with t increasing linearly, you would get this. So, but in this case, I'm wrapping t or time every 2 pi, just because sine's values repeat every 2 pi. So once you hit 2 pi, you start back at 0. So that's why we have the sawtooth looking wave on top. And so the timbre of a sound is the property of its harmonics or sidebands. And so FM gives us a way to add these to sounds. Here is a modulated sine wave. So in this example, I'm using FM synthesis to, actually, let's go ahead and just implement this real quick to hear what it sounds like, and then I'll explain it. All right. So in that example, you have a base wave or a foundational wave. That's called the carrier wave. And that wave is a sine. I'm going to modulate the frequency or phase of that wave using another sine wave. So that's what this modulation matrix here is doing, is I have these different waveform generators, operator 1 and operator 2, and I'm saying operator 2 should feed into operator 1, which is going to be output as a carrier wave. In the presentation, I gave the modulator a frequency ratio of half that of the carriers. And so let's see what that sounds like. And let's remove the modulator. We've got a pure tone and a funky, throaty kind of sound. All right. So all that's happening here is we're adding the phase of this sine component here, or we're adding this sine wave to the base phase of our carrier wave. So the wave that's corresponding to the modulator is this blue dotted sine wave. The linear phase on its own is this yellow triangular sawtooth. When we add them together, we get this pink waveform shape where you can see how it's kind of bulging up and then convex and then concave repeating. And it's repeating every 2 turns because the ratio of the modulator's frequency is half that of the carriers. So that means it's going to happen half as much. And what does that do to our output wave? Well, where the slope of our phase is steepest, we're going to have a higher frequency. So you can see like towards the very beginning, our slope is much steeper in the pink graph than it is in the base yellow dotted line. So that right there is condensing the frequency. It's making it higher. And then towards the top near the first peak, you can see that it's much more flat. So that's spreading the frequency out as it's making it a lower frequency node. Okay. All right. Here's an animation I made that kind of shows what happens as we increase the weight of the modulating wave. So some crazy stuff can happen. Where as that modulator overpowers the base phase, you start to get more and more high frequency wave shapes. So you can see there are lots of peaks and valleys there in the output wave. And so if we were to demonstrate that in the synth itself, what happens if I raise the modulation index really high? So we get more and louder harmonics. All right, so that's cool and all, but it'd probably be cooler if we like actually made a musical sound. So now that we're equipped with this knowledge, can we try to break down that electric piano sound that I played earlier and recreate it? All right, so let's go back to the synth and listen to it again and see if we can pick out all the different components of the sound. All right, so what do we hear? Well, first, at the very start of the sound in the attack phase, we hear a sharp bell or tine. It very quickly decays into that more throaty sound, which as the note sustains, decays further to a pure tone. And that pure tone has a little bit of warble to it. All right, so let's reset the patch and we'll start with the pure tone again. And let's build this sound up. Okay, we'll start with the bell or the tine. So bells are generally characterized as having inharmonic ratios. So the overtones in bells are generally not harmonic, they're more dissonant. And what that means is they usually have complicated ratios, either higher integer ratios or ratios that aren't whole number fractions. So a classic bell sound in FM, we can probably get using a ratio of 4.77, or we can definitely get, because I know that this sounds like a bell, but okay, so again, we're gonna use operator 2 as a modulator on operator 1. And we're gonna change the frequency ratio of operator 2 to be 4.77. Let's hear what this sounds like. That kind of sounds like a bell, right? Except a normal bell would decay. This sound doesn't decay. All right. But in our e-piano example, it didn't really sound like a church bell. It was really more like a tine. It was a really bright sound. So let's see what happens if we sweep our ratio higher and extend the sidebands out into higher frequency territory. All right, that's up there. I think that that's probably a good place to stay. It doesn't sound very pleasing to the ear right now, but right now it's the only thing we're hearing. One, two, it's not decaying out, so we're just kind of sitting there listening to it. So what else can we do to make that sound decay? Well, we use something called an envelope. And what are envelopes? Well, envelopes are a way to make sound evolve over time. And a really classic envelope is called the ADSR envelope, and it stands for attack, decay, sustain, release. And so attack is how long it takes for a sound to ramp up from 0 to full volume. Decay is how long it takes for a sound to go from full volume to its sustain level. And sustain is its level relative to the full volume. So if you had, a sustain of 0.8, then your sustain level is 80% that of your full attack level. And release is how long it takes a sound to go from sustain to 0. So let's see if we can make our bell decay. So what do we need to do? Well, probably we need to lower the decay on our carrier wave and also reduce the sustain level to 0 or some very low level, but we'll just go with 0 for now. That's already like half of an electric piano. All right. So how do we achieve the body? Well, the body had a punchy tone towards the front, but it wasn't, that in your face. So we can start with a sine wave, modulating another sine wave, but maybe keep the ratio at 1:1. It definitely wasn't dissonant, so we're not going to do anything crazy. Let's start with that. All right. So we'll add another carrier, and then we'll modulate that other carrier with another operator, another waveform. And let's hear what this sounds like. And we're kind of most of the way there. I'm going to adjust the volume of the tine sound. But now that punchy sound isn't decaying. So we're going to just on the modulator fade the modulation out so that the sidebands go away over time. So we're going to drop the sustain to 0.1, maybe give it a long K so that it takes a little while to fade. And we'll try that. Okay. So we're most of the way there, but there's no warble. So how do we get a warble? Well, the warble is due to something called the chorus effect. And the reason it's called that is because when you have multiple instruments or voices playing or singing at the same time in the real world, they're never perfectly in tune. So you get what's called the chorus effect, where there's constructive and destructive interference between the waves that create that wavering sound. So in order to mimic that, we're just going to add another carrier with the exact same structure as the last body carrier that we added. But we're going to detune them from each other to make them slightly out of tune. So tune the first one up 5 cents, and I'll tune the new one down 5 cents, and I'll match their envelopes and try again. And there it is. And you can kind of play around and do all sorts of different things, like they're playing with the bell sound, or you can, maybe we can make it even punchier in the body. See, I like that. So it's a really powerful way to create these kinds of sounds. And I mean, FM synthesis is really known for its metallic kind of sounds. But a lot of FM synths nowadays, they'll incorporate a ton of different features. When I add carriers, that's really like a form of additive synthesis. You can scale it up to have a ton of carriers, a ton of modulators, do a ton of different things, then, throw in filters and effects and all that stuff. And then you can get really, really complicated sounds. Like obviously this electric piano sound isn't that complicated, but it sounds nice. Okay. So if y'all have been paying attention, you'll notice I talked a lot about modifying phase and not about modifying frequency. That's because most FM synths are actually not frequency modulators, they're phase modulators. And the reason for that is because, one, with sine waves, there's no difference. Two, with frequency, and you're doing a frequency modulation, you actually have to take the integral of the modulator. And that can cause some issues, like if you have a DC offset, if you have a signal that doesn't average 0, then you end up shifting the pitch over time instead of having a constant pitch, which is not really desirable. But that's also the reason why phase modulation is identical to frequency modulation when you use sine waves, because the integral of sine is cosine. Well, cosine is just a phase shifted sine, so it's going to sound exactly the same except for the starting point of your wave. But yeah, it's also like easier to program a phase modulation synth than a frequency modulation synth. So anyway, thanks a bunch for listening. Here's links to the synth, GitHub, and my LinkedIn. Does anyone have any questions?
No, it's not loud. No, that was really cool. Like I was kind of interested in doing something not this good, but like, that kind of thing. I was just kind of curious, how do you pick like the UI even? And like, what's kind of your process of this kind of?
All right, so I cut my motivations Yeah, so I was inspired by the Korg OPSIX, and this UI then is also inspired by the Korg OPSIX with the ratio dials and the modulation index crossfaders. Um, one thing that's nice about the OPSIX is that as you turn these ratio dials, it defaults to integer ratios, which are more consonant. So it's more musical. They also scale the modulation index so that I think what they do, and at least how I implemented it based on my ear, is they have a exponential curve on the modulation index. So at 10, you're at 10, but you're not really at a 1.0 modulation index until you're at like 3 point something on the crossfader. So that just gives you more of a musical range with the knob. Like as you noticed, it kind of sounds really funky the higher you put the modulation index up. And like once you're past a certain point, it almost just sounds the same. So there's no point in really differentiating between like a real modulation index of 8 and a real modulation index of 10. But yeah, that's what kind of inspired me about the UI. It's not all that, right? Like I have a modulation matrix to determine the algorithm. The Korg OPSIX only has preset algorithms that you can select. I mean, I think there's a custom algorithm selector too, but it's not like as easy to work with as a modulation index matrix. I coded the UI in SolidJS. Yeah. Hmm? Backend is Rust and WASM, WebAssembly. So it was a super fun project. Like I picked it like just because I wanted to learn Rust, and I'm a project-based learner, so I needed like yeah, like a couple months in my spare time. Yeah. Um, Joel, I think. Oh, sorry, Daniel.
Um, yeah, so I know like FM synthesis can create all these like overtones, right? So
Mhm.
aliasing can be an issue. How do you deal with that?
All right, so I went down a huge rabbit hole with this, and I actually found aliasing to not be that huge of an issue. And when I tried to deal with it, I was like, one, like, what does aliasing sound like? Two, is it actually happening that often? And three, my solutions were coloring the output more in a negative way. So I just didn't even like, I think aliasing is going to come up more with super high ratios. Um, and the UI is restricted to 32x, which is still really high, but um, I mean, I guess if I were to do something crazy and maybe feed a bunch of really high frequency signals into each other, I would get it, but you would have to be trying to do something silly to kind of run into it. Yeah, but things like putting in low pass filters just that weren't under the user's control. That was the main thing. But I just and then there were like wave shape. So instead of using like so for wave shapes that have big discontinuities, those generate like high frequency sidebands. Um, So you could, instead of using a sawtooth wave, when you're using a sawtooth wave, it could be like a gentle saw that doesn't drop off like at a 90-degree angle. Maybe it drops off at like a 85 or 75-degree angle or something like that. So you can control for it too in the wave shapes. But again, like I didn't really feel a need to do that. So, Dan.
Yeah, we've got a. I was just curious, first of all, very cool, really great
Thanks.
project. I don't know anything about electric piano sounds, like classically, were they done with FM synth? Because it seems so apt, it seems like it works.
No, so I think the most classic electric piano is probably the Rhodes. And I think that has real like metal tines in it. Yeah. But yeah, FM synthesis, because it specializes in metallic sounds, like yeah, it does a really convincing electric piano. But
Every pop song from the late 80s.
oh yeah, it has like a
That
DX7 in
sound.
it. Yeah, for sure. But I mean, I've heard like a Rhodes piano, and personally, like I like FM synthesis, but you can't really like get that same sound exactly from it. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that sound.